You ever have that friend from like high school or something that you really enjoyed hanging out with, and you go to see what they've been up to since then, just to find out they went off the rails and look like a goddamn mobile game now? Farming is like one of the last jobs you'd ever actually see me doing. I mean, you literally gotta shovel bullshit all day. Which is weird because Harvest Moon was one of my favorite games to play growing up, and I think that's true for a lot of people. These games are just comfy. I seriously can't think of any better way to describe them. So I was feeling a little nostalgic the other day, you know, as you do, and I decided to see what my old friend Harvest Moon has been up to, and dear God, what the hell happened here? This looks like something you'd find on the App Store if you searched Harvest Moon, then scrolled all the way to the bottom, and nothing good ever happens down there. So why does Harvest Moon look like this now? How did we even get to this point? Well, why don't we start at the beginning and go down the rabbit hole that is the Harvest Moon franchise. No, Harvest Moon got its start on the Super Nintendo in 1997, just in time for everyone to not care about the Super Nintendo anymore. Yeah, this was an extremely late release, and because of that, not a lot of people bothered to pick it up, which means if you held on to your copy from back then... The Super Nintendo version was known as Bokojo Monogatari, or Ranch Story in Japan, and was developed by Pac-In Video. A little while after the game released in Japan, a company you may have heard of called Natsume came along and offered to publish it in the West, which would ultimately lead to the birth of Harvest Moon. Now, the Super Nintendo version is, well, it's Harvest Moon, I guess. You can really tell this was their first attempt at something like this. All of the core elements that make up a Harvest Moon game are here. Crops, animals, fishing, even marriage was here. But it all feels a bit bare bones. I've heard this game had a bit of a rocky development with financial issues and strict deadlines holding the project back, which, yeah, I could definitely see that. There's a lot of potential here, but there's just so many rough edges. Like, you can only hold one tool at a time, so you have to keep going back and forth to your shed whenever you want to swap tools. The village is pretty lifeless as well, and events feel kind of tacked on. Additionally, Natsume didn't do the greatest job translating some of the dialogue, but if you played any Harvest Moon game, you know that's kind of expected. Also, my wife left me. Yeah, that's apparently something that can happen in this game. Soon after the Super Nintendo version, though, Pac-In Video would merge with Victor Entertainment, which resulted in them being renamed Victor Interactive Software. One of the first games they developed under this new name would be Harvest Moon GB, which was the franchise's first release on a portable system. A few months later, they'd release an enhanced version of Harvest Moon GB on the Game Boy Color, and you are not gonna believe what they added. It's color. They added color. This was pretty much just a straight port of the Super Nintendo version, so nothing too noteworthy here, but it would eventually get a few sequels. Now, up until this point, Harvest Moon was only a moderate success in the West. It reviewed decently well and had its fair share of fans, but it was still a relatively unknown franchise. But once the series finally made the jump to 3D, that wasn't the case anymore. Harvest Moon 64 feels like the game they were trying to make on the Super Nintendo, but fully realized this time. They improved on pretty much every aspect of the original game. The village is a lot more lively, the characters are super memorable, and not to mention all of the quality of life improvements, like there's finally a proper inventory system, thank God. A year later though, the series would see its first installment on a non-Nintendo console with Back to Nature on the original PlayStation. While it started out as just a port of Harvest Moon 64, it eventually turned into a completely unique game that just reused a lot of 64's assets. This was basically the series' heyday though. Chances are, if you remember Harvest Moon fondly, you probably started playing around this time. Next we get Save the Homeland, which was the first entry to feature a more unique story that wasn't just, hey, Grandpa's dead, here's a farm, guess. It featured multiple endings and had a bigger focus on befriending villagers. It was definitely the most plot-heavy Harvest Moon game at the time. But after Save the Homeland, Victor Interactive Software was acquired by Marvelous Entertainment, who would handle all future releases. The first game they did was Friends of Mineral Town. This was more or less a portable version of Back to Nature, which a majority of people consider to be the best console version of Harvest Moon. This game honestly takes everything that was great about the franchise up until this point and puts it on a handheld. If you ever wanted to get into Harvest Moon, I'd say start here. This really is the best of what the series has to offer. After Friends of Mineral Town, we'd get the game I personally grew up on, which was Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life. This game's all about playing through your character's entire life, and hopefully making it a wonderful life, I guess. You start a farm, get married, have a kid, watch them grow up, and then you die. You know, the circle of life and all that. Getting married and raising your kid was honestly a lot of fun, but everything else was just more the same. It was around this time, though, that they started to do something a bit strange with Harvest Moon. You see, while something like Pokemon would release multiple versions with exclusive Pokemon in each, Harvest Moon started releasing two separate versions, with the only difference being the gender of the character you play as. Yeah, instead of just choosing male or female, most Harvest Moon games featured only a male protagonist. If you wanted to play as a female, you'd have to buy a completely separate version. In Japan, this was kind of always a thing, starting with the original Game Boy releases. The Japanese version of Back to Nature even had a separate female version, which was literally called Harvest Moon for Girl. However, back then, whenever Natsume would bring these games over to the West, they'd usually combine the male and female versions into one release, or just not even bother with the female version. But then they just kinda gave up on that. Meet Harvest Moon: More Friends of Mineral Town, and Harvest Moon: Another Wonderful Life, where the only difference is that you play as a girl instead of a boy. This confused the hell out of me as a kid. Hell, it still confuses me. Why do these need to be completely separate games? Why do the titles make them sound like they're enhanced versions when that isn't the case at all? Fortunately, they wouldn't do this for too much longer, with the DS being the last system to have a gender-specific game, but oh boy, speaking of the DS games, this is where the series started to go a bit off the rails in my opinion. Now, in 2006, we get one last Harvest Moon game on the GameCube in the form of Magical Melody, and it wasn't great, but afterwards it was off to the DS, and we got a few games like Harvest Moon DS, Harvest Moon DSQ, Harvest Moon DS Island of Happiness, Harvest Moon DS Sunshine Islands, Harvest Moon DS Grand Bazaar, and Harvest Moon DS The Tale of Two Towns. But it didn't stop there. The Harvest Moon train just kept on rolling. There was the PSP game, the two Wii games, not to mention all the spin-offs and re-releases. There was just too much Harvest Moon in the late 2000s, and it was at this point that I feel a lot of people, myself included, started to view Harvest Moon as kind of a shovelware franchise. Now, most of these games weren't terrible, it was just more Harvest Moon, and then even more Harvest Moon. Because of this, things weren't looking too great for the series. The formula had gotten stale, and this onslaught of games releasing so close to one another wasn't helping. Harvest Moon desperately needed a breath of fresh air. It needed to switch things up. It needed a new beginning. So we got one. Literally. Harvest Moon: A New Beginning is exactly what the series needed at this point. While it was still the same old Harvest Moon at its core, it did a lot to breathe new life into the franchise. The biggest new addition was customization. You can now fully customize your character, farm, and even parts of the village. It felt like such a natural evolution to the formula, and it was exciting. Harvest Moon was back. I can't wait to see what they do next. Harvest Moon: The Lost Valley blows. I mean, yeah, there were some questionable Harvest Moon games in the past, but Lost Valley was just so much worse. It tried to combine Harvest Moon with Minecraft, I guess. Like, you could freely edit the terrain, but it's super tedious to do and makes moving around the map extremely difficult. There's also no town for you to visit, so the world feels extremely empty and, well, boring. But how do you go from something like a new beginning to this in a matter of 2 years? And things didn't get much better from here either. The next game, Seeds of Memories, was literally a phone game, and I mean, I think the gameplay speaks for itself. The next couple of entries saw the series returning to consoles, but like, not that it mattered. So what happened here? Well, what if I told you these Harvest Moon games are fake? Well, kind of. To explain, we need to rewind a bit. So, up until the release of A New Beginning, Marvelous would handle the actual game design and Natsume would take care of the localization. But then Marvelous realized, why are they paying Natsume to bring these games over to the West when they could just do it themselves? I mean, they already had an American division, why not use it? But there was a bit of a small problem. While they owned all the rights to the actual games, they didn't actually own the name Harvest Moon. Natsume did, and they weren't gonna just give it up. I mean, why would they? Harvest Moon is their biggest franchise. So Marvelous was forced to come up with a new name for the series outside of Japan. They actually came up with quite a few names, my favorite being Plow and Propose. I don't even got anything to say about the name. It's just fucking Plow and Propose. But eventually they decided on Story of Seasons, and if you look the series up, yeah, there's no mistaking it. This is Harvest Moon, just with a new name. They even went and remade Friends of Mineral Town under this new name, which is really cool. So, what's the deal then with these other Harvest Moon games? Well, like I said before, Natsume wasn't willing to give up the name, so they took the opportunity to start making their own Harvest Moon games, and well, you all saw how that went. But like, I don't know, this whole thing just feels kinda shady to me. They're basically misleading people by making them think this is the same old Harvest Moon when that isn't the case at all. I've seen a lot of people that just assume Harvest Moon is a shell of its former self and have no idea that Story of Seasons is even a thing. But Natsume was completely in their rights to do this. I mean, it'd be stupid of them not to keep using the name. Like I said before, Harvest Moon is big for them. It's just a shame that this whole thing wasn't really messaged properly. It makes it feel like they're knowingly deceiving fans. It's also kind of sad to see things end up like this. The name Harvest Moon holds a lot of sentimental value for a lot of people. But, oh well, at least the spirit of the series lives on.